He thought he'd inherited ashes, until his dog uncovered the secret powerful men were willing to kill for. Homeless. After college, a Navy SEAL moved to an abandoned farm. His dog found what they hid inside. The Smoky Mountains were silent the day Ethan Cole stepped onto the charred foundation of his grandfather's farm. No money, no home. Just a burned house and a loyal K9 who refused to leave the fireplace stones. When the dog started digging, Ethan realized the fire wasn't the end of the story. It was the cover. Comment 1 if you'd stand your ground, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. The first thing Ethan Cole noticed was how quiet the mountains were. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind you see printed on postcards with golden sunsets and fishing cabins. This was a heavy quiet. The kind that pressed against your ears and made you aware of your own breathing. He stood at the edge of what used to be a farmhouse in the Smoky Mountains of eastern Tennessee, boots planted on cracked concrete that had once been a porch. The November wind moved through the bare trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and old smoke. The structure itself was gone, collapsed years ago, reduced to a scatter of charred beams and a blackened stone chimney that leaned like a tired sentinel against the gray sky. This was supposed to be his reset. Ethan adjusted the strap of the duffel slung over his shoulder. Everything he owned was inside it. 2 changes of clothes, discharge papers, a framed photograph of his old SEAL team, and a folded letter from an attorney in Knoxville informing him that this property had been left to him by his grandfather, a grandfather he'd met twice in his life. Beside him stood Rex. The Belgian Malinois was lean and alert despite the long drive. His coat was a deep sable brown, darker along the back, lighter near the chest. A faint scar traced along the bridge of his muzzle, souvenir from an explosion overseas that neither of them talked about, though both carried it. Rex's ears were up, eyes scanning the tree line as if this burned farm might suddenly ambush them. "You smell it too?" Ethan murmured. Rex lowered his head and padded forward, nose grazing the ground where the old living room had once stood. He stopped at a cluster of fireplace stones, blackened but still intact, and began pacing in a tight circle. Ethan stepped onto the foundation, the concrete cold even through his boots. He crouched near the hearth. Ash still lingered in the cracks between the stones. Whatever fire had taken this house hadn't been small. He exhaled slowly, the breath fogging in front of him. 3 months ago, he had been sitting in a lecture hall at the University of Tennessee, trying to ignore the way fluorescent lights flickered above him. He'd been working toward a degree in environmental engineering. The GI housing allowance was supposed to cover his rent. Then the letter came. Administrative review. Delayed disbursement. Temporary suspension. His landlord had given him 2 weeks. His roommate had already found someone else to take his spot. His parents, when he called, told him he was trained to survive anything. "You'll figure it out," his father had said, the same way he used to after Little League losses. Only this time there was no next game. The farm had been the only thing left. Now, standing here, it felt like someone had handed him the bones of a promise and forgotten to mention there was no flesh left on it. Rex let out a low rumble in his throat. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The property stretched across rolling acres bordered by dense forest. A sagging tobacco barn sat about 50 yards downhill, its roof patched with rust. Beyond that, fog drifted across the valley like slow-moving smoke. "Guess this is home," Ethan said quietly. He stepped off the foundation and walked toward the barn. The wooden doors hung crooked on their hinges, one side barely attached. When he pushed it open, The interior breathed out a scent of hay, old wood, and something metallic. The space was large, shadowed. Sunlight pierced through slats in the walls, striping the dirt floor with pale beams. A ladder led to a loft that looked stable enough. It wasn't much, but it had walls and a roof. Rex moved ahead of him, sniffing corners, checking the perimeter like he used to sweep compounds overseas. Satisfied, he returned to Ethan's side. Ethan set the duffel down and ran a hand over his face. He hadn't shaved in days. The mountains were colder than Knoxville, colder than he'd expected. His breath came in slow pulls, steadying. He closed his eyes for a moment. The silence pressed in, and with it came the echo of something else. A memory. The distant crack of gunfire, the concussion of a blast, the smell of burning dust. His chest tightened. Rex nudged his thigh. Ethan opened his eyes and looked down. The dog's amber gaze held him there, grounding him. "I'm here," Ethan whispered, unsure if he meant it for Rex or himself. He climbed the ladder to the loft and tested the boards with his weight. They held. He rolled out a thin sleeping pad and laid his jacket across it. It wasn't comfort, but it was shelter. As the sun dipped lower behind the ridge, the temperature fell with it. Wind slid through gaps in the barn walls, carrying the distant call of a crow. Ethan climbed back down and walked once more to the old foundation. Rex was there again, not pacing this time, staring, his nose pressed firmly against the cracked stones of the fireplace. "Buddy," Ethan said softly, "there's nothing left." Rex didn't move. The dog pawed once at the edge of a loose slab. A scraping sound echoed against the hollow beneath. Ethan paused. He stepped closer and crouched, brushing away leaves and bits of soot. The slab shifted slightly under his fingers. Beneath it, the soil looked darker, less compact than the rest. The wind picked up, rustling through the skeletal remains of the property. Somewhere far down the mountain, an engine hummed faintly, then faded. Ethan rested his hand on Rex's back. "You think there's something here?" Rex's ears twitched. He let out a short, focused huff, the same sound he used to make when he'd catch the scent of explosives buried under rubble thousands of miles away. Ethan looked at the fireplace stones again. For the first time since stepping onto this land, something other than despair stirred in his chest. Curiosity, maybe even the faintest thread of purpose. He stood slowly and glanced across the valley as twilight settled in, turning the ridges blue and silver. "All right," he said quietly. "Tomorrow." The mountains didn't answer. They just watched. Behind him, the broken farmhouse cast long shadows across the cold earth. Ahead of him, the barn waited in silence, and at his side, Rex refused to leave the ashes. That night, the mountains grew darker than Ethan remembered darkness being. By the time he climbed into the loft, the sky had swallowed the last strip of orange along the ridge. The wind pressed against the barn walls, slipping through cracks like thin fingers. He lay on his back, jacket folded under his head, staring up at the rafters where old nails caught faint moonlight. Rex circled twice before settling close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his body through the sleeping pad. The quiet returned. At first, it was manageable. Just the hum of insects fading into the cold, the distant rustle of dry leaves, the hollow creak of aging timber. Then the wind shifted. It howled through a broken seam in the roof, high and sharp. And just like that, the mountains were gone. In their place came desert heat, the metallic taste of dust, the sudden crack of gunfire echoing through a narrow street. Ethan's chest tightened. His heartbeat kicked up without permission. He saw it again. Flashes. A door blown inward. A burst of flame. The weight of gear digging into his shoulders. The shout of his teammate over the radio. And the moment after, when everything became smoke and ringing silence. Ethan sat upright in the loft, breath shallow. Rex was already awake. The dog pressed against him, one paw resting firmly on Ethan's knee. Not frantic, not startled, just present. "I'm good," Ethan muttered, though his hands trembled slightly. He swung his legs over the edge of the loft and climbed down into the barn. The dirt floor felt steady beneath his boots. He stepped outside. Cold air hit his face, sharp and real. The valley lay still under a wash of silver moonlight. Fog hugged the lower ground like a quiet river. No gunfire, no smoke, no chaos. Just mountains. Ethan inhaled slowly, counted to 4. Exhaled. This was what reintegration was supposed to feel like, they'd told him. Stability, civilian life, college lectures and quiet apartments, a normal schedule. Instead, 3 months after discharge, he had found himself sleeping in a borrowed truck in a grocery store parking lot, staring at emails from the VA that never seemed to resolve anything. Pending review. Please allow additional processing time. Processing time. He'd given the Navy 8 years of his life. Now he couldn't get a housing payment approved in time to keep a roof over his head. Rex leaned against his leg again, looking up as if to confirm the present. Ethan reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You're the only one who never needed paperwork," he said quietly. Rex's tail thumped once against the barn door. They had met on Ethan's second deployment. Rex had been young then, still sharp around the edges, all muscle and instinct. Together, they had cleared roads and buildings. Rex had alerted on hidden explosives more times than Ethan could count. He had saved lives without ever asking for recognition. After discharge, Rex had been offered to another handler. Ethan had signed the adoption papers before the ink dried. Back inside the barn, Ethan climbed back to the loft and lay down again. The flashbacks dulled, replaced by exhaustion. Sleep came in fragments. When dawn finally broke, it arrived quietly, light filtering through the slats, turning the dust in the air into floating gold. Ethan opened his eyes to the sound of birds somewhere beyond the barn walls. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the smell of hay and wood grounded him. Rex was already alert. They stepped outside into a morning washed in pale blue light. Frost edged the grass. The burned foundation looked less menacing in daylight, though no less lonely. Ethan walked toward it again. He crouched near the fireplace stones, studying the slab Rex had nudged the night before. In daylight, he could see the difference in soil tone more clearly, slightly disturbed, not natural settling. He brushed more debris aside but stopped short of prying it loose. Not yet. Instead, he stood and surveyed the land. 60 acres according to the paperwork, mostly forested, with a slope down toward a creek bed he could faintly hear. The barn stood to the west. An old fence line traced the perimeter in sagging sections. He imagined what his grandfather must have seen when he stood here decades ago. Fields planted, smoke rising from the chimney, cattle moving along the ridge. Ethan barely remembered the man. A quiet handshake at a family reunion. A strong grip. A weathered face. That was it. Why leave him this place? A truck passed faintly on the distant mountain road, the sound drifting down like a reminder that the world still moved beyond these trees. Ethan felt the weight of choice settle in. He could leave. Sell what was left of the property for whatever a burned foundation and broken barn were worth. Move to Knoxville, find temporary work, sleep on a friend's couch if he swallowed his pride hard enough. Or he could stay. Not because it was easy, not because it was practical, but because for the first time since stepping off the base after discharge, no one here expected anything from him. No deadlines, no processing forms, no performance reviews, just land, and a dog who refused to walk away. Ethan looked down at Rex. "You think this is it?" he asked softly. "Our last stand?" Rex turned his head toward the tree line, ears twitching at some distant sound only he could hear. Then he looked back at Ethan and held the gaze. Steady. Ethan nodded once. "All right," he said. "We'll see what's under those stones." The sorrow that had followed him up the mountain hadn't disappeared, but beneath it, something stronger was taking root. Resolve. Ethan didn't touch the fireplace slab that morning. Not yet. Instead, he did what he had been trained to do when stepping into uncertain territory. Establish security, assess resources, build structure. He and Rex walked the perimeter first. The land rolled gently before dipping toward a narrow creek that cut through the lower edge of the property. Frost clung to brittle grass. The air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke from some unseen cabin across the valley. Rex moved ahead in disciplined arcs, sweeping left and right, nose low. Not frantic, controlled. The same methodical pattern he had used overseas when clearing village roads. "Clear left," Ethan murmured instinctively. The words felt strange in this quiet place, but they steadied him. At the northern boundary, Ethan found the first problem. The fence line was barely functional. Rotted posts leaning at odd angles, barbed wire sagging loose in places. One section near the road had been cut clean through, not snapped from age but severed. He crouched, running his fingers along the metal. The cut was sharp, recent enough that rust hadn't claimed it fully. Probably hunters, he told himself. But Rex stood stiff beside him, ears pointed toward the road. Ethan glanced uphill. The mountain road curved beyond a stand of oak trees. It was empty now. He stood slowly. "We'll fix it," he said. "One thing at a time." Back at the barn, he set the duffel on an old wooden crate and began taking inventory. There was an ancient hand pump near the rear wall, its iron body streaked with rust. A cracked rain barrel leaned against one corner. A small pile of weathered lumber lay stacked along the far side. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ethan rolled up his sleeves and went to work. He disassembled the hand pump carefully, laying the parts out on a tarp. The bolts resisted at first, but patience and steady pressure loosened them. Rex lay nearby, head on his paws, watching every movement. "Remember cobble?" Ethan muttered, cleaning grit from a valve. "When the generator went out, and we had to strip it down with a multi-tool and a prayer?" Rex's tail thumped once. The memory came with a faint echo of adrenaline, but here, there was no explosion waiting, only mountain wind and the distant caw of a crow. By midday, Ethan had the pump reassembled. He gripped the handle and pulled. It groaned in protest. He pulled again. The third attempt brought a hollow, echoing gulp from somewhere below. On the fifth pump, a thin stream of muddy water sputtered out, splashing against the dirt floor. Ethan laughed under his breath. "Look at that." He kept pumping until the water ran clearer. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. A small victory. the kind that mattered. He moved next to the barn doors. One hung crooked, barely attached. The other lay flat against the ground where it had fallen long ago. Using spare boards and old hinges salvaged from a crate, he reinforced the stronger side enough to close it halfway. It wouldn't stop a determined intruder, but it would block wind. As the afternoon wore on, sunlight shifted across the barn floor in long golden bands. Dust floated through the beams like drifting ash. Around 3 o'clock, the low rumble of an engine rolled across the valley. Rex was on his feet instantly. Ethan froze. The engine grew louder, climbing the mountain road. It slowed as it passed the property, not stopping, just slowing. Ethan stepped to the barn entrance and looked through a crack between the boards. A dark pickup truck eased along the road, tinted windows reflecting the afternoon light. It didn't pull in. It didn't honk. It just continued past, but not before slowing enough that whoever saw behind the wheel could take in the entire burned foundation and the man working in the barn. Rex's growl was low and steady. "It's fine," Ethan whispered, though he wasn't sure if that was true. The truck disappeared around the bend. The quiet returned. But it felt different now. Less neutral. More watchful. Ethan exhaled slowly and returned to work. By evening, he had rigged 2 small solar lanterns inside the barn and cleared a space near the loft ladder for cooking. He built a simple fire pit outside using loose stones from the property and tested it with a small flame. Rex circled the perimeter once more before settling near the entrance as dusk settled in. Ethan sat on an overturned bucket, staring at the ridge as the sky deepened from blue to violet. He felt something shift inside him. The sorrow from the night before had thinned. It was still there, an undercurrent, but no longer paralyzing. In its place stood something firmer, purpose. He hadn't asked for this land. He hadn't chosen the fire-scarred foundation, but he could choose what happened next. From the loft, he could see the old fireplace stones catching the last sliver of light. Rex's head lifted suddenly. The dog turned toward the burned house again, not pacing this time, watching. Ethan followed his gaze. The slab near the fireplace seemed ordinary in the fading light, just stone and ash. But Rex stepped forward and let out a short, sharp huff, the same alert he used when he had located something buried that didn't belong. Ethan stood. "We'll dig tomorrow," he said quietly. Rex didn't argue. The mountains darkened around them, wrapping the farm in cool shadow. For the first time since arriving, Ethan felt less like a man running from something, and more like a man building toward it. The barn might have had no doors, but it was standing, and so was he. The next morning broke clear and sharp, frost silvering the ridges and settling into the low fields like a quiet warning. Ethan rose before sunrise, the habits of years in uniform refusing to fade. Rex was already alert, ears forward, watching the eastern horizon lighten over the smoky mountains. Ethan walked straight to the fireplace slab. He brought a pry bar he'd found in the barn and a short-handled shovel. Rex stood beside him, muscles coiled, nose hovering over the same stone that had captured his attention for 2 days. "All right," Ethan muttered. "Let's see." He wedged the pry bar beneath the edge of the slab and leaned into it. The stone shifted with a dull scrape. Soil crumbled loose. He worked slowly, methodically, careful not to crack the slab completely. After several minutes, it tilted enough for him to grip and drag aside. The earth beneath was darker, looser than the surrounding ground. Rex's posture sharpened. Ethan knelt and began digging with his hands before switching to the shovel. The soil gave way faster than expected. Within inches, metal struck metal with a muted clink. He froze. Brushing dirt aside, he uncovered the corner of something rectangular. Steel, rusted but intact. A lockbox. Ethan's heartbeat picked up. Not fear, not yet, but anticipation. He cleared more dirt away and lifted the box out of the shallow cavity. It was heavier than it looked. The padlock had corroded. He struck it twice with the pry bar. On the third blow, it snapped. He opened the lid. Inside lay a sealed envelope wrapped in plastic and a bundle of folded land documents, also protected from moisture. The handwriting on the envelope was neat, deliberate. Ethan Cole. His name. He swallowed. Before he could tear it open, the low rumble of an engine drifted down the mountain road again. Rex snapped his head up, growling. Ethan stood slowly, envelope still in his hand. The truck from the day before crested the hill, and this time did not slow. It turned into the gravel path leading to the property. Ethan's muscles tightened automatically. He set the lockbox down but kept the envelope tucked inside his jacket. The truck rolled to a stop near the barn. It was newer up close, black with chrome trim that caught the sunlight. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, mid-40s, tailored coat, boots too clean for this terrain. He looked around like he was appraising something. "Morning," the man called out, voice smooth and confident. "You Ethan Cole?" Ethan stepped forward slowly. Rex moved in front of him without being told. "That depends," Ethan said evenly. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Blake Turner. I believe we've inherited a shared interest in this valley." Ethan didn't offer his hand. Turner glanced at the burned foundation and then at the barn. "Sorry about the house. Shame what happened to your grandfather's place." "You knew him?" Ethan asked. Turner adjusted his coat. "Met him a few times. Stubborn old man." Rex let out a sharper growl. Turner's gaze flicked toward the dog. "Easy there." Ethan rested a hand lightly on Rex's back. "He's fine." Turner took a slow breath, then gestured toward the ridgeline. "You're sitting on prime development land. 60 acres with road access, water below, mountain views. Investors have been watching this valley for years." "I'm not selling," Ethan replied. Turner smiled again. "You haven't heard my offer." Ethan's jaw tightened. $100,000, Turner said. "Cash. Immediate transfer. You walk away clean. No property taxes, no maintenance, no headaches." The number hung in the cold air. For a moment, Ethan saw it clearly. An apartment in Knoxville. Stable work. Heat that didn't fail in winter. No digging in frozen soil. Then he remembered the landlord's notice taped to his old door. The way his bank account had drained while paperwork processed. The nights sleeping in his truck. "I just got here," Ethan said quietly. "I'm not walking away." Turner's smile thinned slightly. "You should consider the alternatives." Ethan held his gaze. Turner gestured toward the road. "Property taxes here aren't forgiving. This place has been neglected. Inspections can get complicated. Zoning laws can be inconvenient." There it was. Not a threat shouted. A threat implied. Rex stepped forward half a pace, stance firm. Turner studied the dog. "You're going to let that animal decide your future?" Ethan's voice dropped a degree colder. "He's the only reason I have one." Silence stretched between them. Turner finally nodded once. "Think it over. I'll be back in a few days." He turned toward his truck, then paused. "And Ethan, accidents happen in old barns. Be careful." The engine started. Gravel crunched. The truck disappeared down the mountain road. The quiet returned, but it no longer felt neutral. Ethan exhaled slowly, pulse still steady but elevated. He looked down at Rex. "You picked a good week to start digging," he murmured. Rex kept watching the road long after the truck vanished. Ethan walked back to the fireplace slab and retrieved the envelope. His hands were steady now. He tore it open. Inside was a handwritten letter. His grandfather's script was unmistakable, firm, deliberate. Ethan read the first line and felt something shift inside his chest. "If you're reading this, it means they're circling again." He lifted his eyes toward the ridgeline where Turner's truck had disappeared. The wind moved through the trees, colder now. What had felt like determination the night before began to harden into something else. Suspicion and rising tension. Ethan stood alone beside the cracked foundation, the letter trembling slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the weight of what it suggested. "If you're reading this, it means they're circling again." He read the line twice. Again. The mountains were still, too still. Rex remained fixed toward the road, ears pricked, posture alert long after Blake Turner's truck had disappeared. Ethan folded the letter halfway and glanced back at the shallow pit where the lockbox had been buried. He knelt and read further. "I never trusted them," the letter continued. "They came offering money when I refused to sell. They spoke of progress and development. I saw greed in their eyes. I told them no." Ethan's jaw tightened. The letter went on to describe survey teams walking the property without permission. Pressure. Offers that increased each year. Subtle warnings about tax complications and fire code inspections. And then one final line written darker than the rest. "If anything ever happens to this house, know it wasn't an accident." Ethan looked up slowly at the charred beams scattered across the earth. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of burned wood that had lingered in the soil for years. He crouched back down near the open cavity beneath the slab. Rex had not moved far. The dog circled the hole, nose hovering just above the disturbed earth. "You smell more?" Ethan asked quietly. Rex huffed once and scratched again at the edge of the cavity, harder this time. Ethan leaned forward and dug deeper. The soil was softer farther down, as if it had been disturbed more recently than the fire itself. His shovel struck something solid again, but this time the sound was hollow. He widened the hole carefully, pushing dirt aside with controlled movements. Beneath the initial cavity lay something unexpected, a metal ring embedded flush with a steel plate no larger than 2 feet across. A hatch, newer than the foundation. The edges were clean, not rusted through like the lockbox. Whoever had installed it had done so deliberately. Ethan froze. The implications settled heavily. The fire had destroyed the house, but something had been protected beneath it. He brushed away more dirt and exposed the full outline of the steel plate. A recessed latch was tucked under one edge, nearly invisible beneath compacted soil. Rex stepped closer, nose pressed firmly against the metal. "Easy," Ethan murmured. He glanced toward the road again. No vehicles, no movement. Still, the quiet felt watched. Ethan wiped his palms against his jeans and slid his fingers under the latch. It resisted at first. He pulled harder. With a metallic groan, the hatch lifted. Cold air breathed upward from below. A narrow cavity, roughly 3 feet deep and lined with concrete, lay beneath the foundation. Inside were 2 waterproof storage containers and a thick, sealed envelope wrapped in plastic. Ethan's pulse thudded steadily in his ears. He climbed carefully into the shallow space and lifted the containers out one by one. They were heavier than the lockbox had been. Rex stood guard above, scanning the tree line. Ethan set the containers on the ground and opened the first. Inside were land surveys, highlighted in bright marker, detailed maps of the valley, sections circled in red ink. The second container held flash drives, carefully labeled. A small hard drive rested beneath them. Beneath that, another envelope bearing his name. Ethan stared at it. "What were you protecting?" he whispered. He opened the envelope. This letter was longer, the handwriting less steady. "Ethan, if you've found this, it means you chose to stay." He exhaled slowly. "They want the water and what lies beneath it," the letter continued. "They talk about resorts and cabins, but I learned the truth too late. There are reports, evidence of illegal dumping in the forest north of our creek, chemicals buried deep. They offered me money to stay quiet. I refused." Ethan felt the cold deepen in his chest. "I gathered proof. I documented what I could. But they are powerful men. If this reaches you, it means you're the only one I trust to decide what to do." Ethan's eyes drifted toward the ridgeline where Turner's truck had disappeared hours earlier. This wasn't about a resort. This was about leverage. Rex's posture changed abruptly. He stiffened. Low growl. Ethan snapped the letter closed and climbed out of the cavity, pulling the hatch shut behind him. He brushed soil loosely over it, but didn't conceal it fully. Not yet. "What is it?" he whispered. Rex's gaze locked onto the tree line along the road. Ethan followed his line of sight. A faint glint of sunlight reflected off something metallic beyond the trees. Binocular lenses. Gone in an instant. Ethan's body shifted automatically into readiness. Shoulders squared, breathing controlled, eyes scanning. He didn't move toward the road. He didn't wave. He simply stood there, letting whoever watched know he had seen them. The glint did not return. After a long moment, Rex's growl subsided to a tense silence. Ethan gathered the containers and carried them into the barn loft. He set them beside his sleeping pad and locked them inside an old wooden trunk he'd reinforced earlier that morning. The emotional shift was undeniable. 2 days ago, this land had felt like the last refuge of a man pushed out of his old life. Now it felt like the center of something far larger. Danger had replaced sorrow. Purpose had replaced confusion. Ethan descended the ladder and stepped back outside. The fireplace slab lay open, soil disturbed, evidence unearthed. Whatever had happened here years ago wasn't finished, and Rex had known it before he did. Ethan knelt and rested a hand on the dog's neck. "You found it," he said quietly. Rex leaned into him. Above them, the Smoky Mountains stood silent and watchful. The ashes no longer felt like ruins. They felt like a warning. Ethan stood beside the broken foundation as the afternoon light thinned into gray. The mountains that had seemed distant and indifferent now felt closer, listening. He didn't like being watched. He especially didn't like being watched without knowing by whom. Rex stayed near his leg, body angled toward the tree line. The dog's breathing was steady, but his posture carried tension like a drawn wire. "We're not alone anymore," Ethan murmured. He didn't need confirmation. The glint in the trees had been real. Someone had observed the dig. Someone knew he'd found something. Ethan walked back to the barn and climbed into the loft, pulling the trunk toward him. He opened it carefully and lifted the second envelope again. The handwriting was shakier than the first letter. He sat cross-legged on the loft floor and began reading from the top. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I failed to stop them in my lifetime. I tried to fight it legally. I contacted county officials, environmental agencies, anyone who would listen. But I was told there wasn't enough evidence, or the paperwork had misplaced itself. Funny how paper disappears when money is involved. Ethan felt his pulse slow into something colder and more focused. Your land borders the Northern Creek, the letter continued. That creek feeds into the Valley Reservoir. Years ago, a construction company began clearing timber upstream under the name of surveying. I walked the ridge and found buried drums, chemicals. I documented everything I could: photos, coordinates, statements, the flash drives. Ethan looked toward the waterproof containers below. They offered to buy my silence. When I refused, the pressure started. Insurance inspections, tax reassessments, code violations. He paused. The words grew darker. The night of the fire, I wasn't home. I was staying in town. They said it was electrical. I know better. Ethan swallowed. He could see it clearly now. The fire as leverage, not accident. Remove the house, lower the property value, intimidate an old man. The letter ended with a final warning. They will return. They always do. If they approach you with money, understand that it is not generosity. It is urgency. Ethan folded the letter carefully. Rex's ears twitched. A distant engine again. Ethan moved silently down the ladder and stepped outside. The black pickup from before had not returned. Instead, a different vehicle rolled slowly down the mountain road, an older white SUV, county decals faintly visible on the door. It passed without stopping. But it slowed. Too much coincidence for two vehicles in 2 days. Ethan's mind began building patterns. If Turner was pushing development, he would want the land quiet, undisputed, uninvestigated. The evidence in that hatch threatened something larger than property value. Rex suddenly turned toward the lower slope near the creek. Another sound. Quieter this time. A metallic click. Ethan's head snapped toward the barn. One of the solar lanterns he had mounted outside flickered and died. He moved quickly, but controlled. Inside the barn, he inspected the wiring. The panel he had secured that morning now hung slightly loose. Not wind damage. The screws had been removed and set carefully aside. Someone had touched it. Recently. Rex's growl deepened. Ethan felt the familiar sharpening of focus he had once relied on in conflict zones. The world narrowed. Every detail sharpened. The way leaves moved, the direction of the wind, the rhythm of his own breath. He walked back outside and scanned the ridge again. Nothing obvious. But the mountain didn't feel empty anymore. It felt measured. He returned to the foundation and examined the disturbed soil. The hatch had been recovered lightly. He knelt and brushed his hand across it. Fresh boot prints. Not his. Slightly larger tread. Cleaner edges. Whoever had been watching hadn't waited long to approach. Ethan rose slowly. They know, he whispered. Rex shifted closer to him, body angled protectively. The emotional shift was immediate. This was no longer curiosity. This was escalation. Ethan walked to the barn and retrieved the flash drives from the trunk. He turned one over in his fingers, labeled Creek Survey 2016. He didn't have power for a laptop yet, no secure internet. But he didn't need to see the files to understand their weight. He needed help. Not from the county, not from developers. From someone who had worn the same uniform and understood the difference between fear and strategy. He pulled his phone from his pocket. No signal in the loft. He stepped toward the highest part of the property near the road. One bar flickered. He scrolled through his contacts and stopped at a name he hadn't dialed since discharge. Sheriff Walter Briggs, retired Marine, owned property 3 ridges over, had once told Ethan, "If you ever need a straight answer, you call me, not a desk." Ethan hesitated. He had built his identity on self-reliance. Calling for help felt like surrender. Rex nudged his hand. Ethan looked down at him. "Guess we don't carry it alone this time," he said quietly. The bar of signal flickered between 1 and none. He pressed dial. The call didn't go through. Not yet. He lowered the phone and looked out over the valley. The sky was shifting toward evening, the temperature dropping fast. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a truck door slammed faintly. Ethan's jaw set. "They're not circling," he muttered. "They're closing in." The mountains darkened, and for the first time since arriving, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. This farm was never meant to be a quiet escape. It was a battlefield he hadn't chosen, but one he was now standing in. Rex stayed at his side, unwavering. The warning beneath the ashes had become a line drawn in the dirt. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to change. Clouds rolled in low and heavy over the Smoky Mountains, swallowing the blue and flattening the horizon into a slate-gray wall. The air thickened, sharp with the scent of incoming snow. Ethan stood at the ridge near the road and watched the weather gather. A storm had been forecast, but forecasts in the mountains were guesses at best. This one looked serious. He lowered his phone again after another failed attempt to reach Sheriff Briggs. The signal blinked out completely. "Guess we're on our own tonight," he said. Rex's ears flicked toward the tree line, then back toward Ethan. They moved quickly. Ethan secured the barn doors as tightly as he could manage, reinforcing the latch with scrap wood. He stacked what little firewood he had closer to the loft ladder and filled 2 old containers with water from the hand pump. By the time the first snowflakes fell, the valley had already gone quiet. At first, it was gentle, fine white flecks drifting down without urgency. Then the wind shifted. It came hard from the north, slamming into the barn walls with a hollow thud. The flakes thickened, turning from soft spirals into driving sheets. Within an hour, the world outside blurred into white. Ethan climbed into the loft and lit one of the solar lanterns. The light flickered uncertainly as the wind howled through the slats. Rex paced once before settling near the ladder, positioned between Ethan and the open barn space below. The storm intensified. Snow lashed sideways, finding its way through every crack in the structure. The temperature dropped rapidly, the kind of cold that bit through layers and settled deep into bone. Ethan pulled on an extra sweater and gloves. He checked the small generator he had wired to power a backup heater, an old propane unit salvaged from a camping kit. He turned the knob. Nothing. He tried again. The engine sputtered once and died. He leaned down and inspected the fuel line. Ice had formed around the intake. The sudden temperature drop had done what mountain cold does best, found weakness and exploited it. "Come on," he muttered, fingers already stiff. He adjusted the line and tried again. The generator coughed but wouldn't catch. Outside, visibility dropped to nearly 0. Through a narrow gap in the barn boards, Ethan saw headlights cut briefly across the ridge before vanishing behind the curtain of snow. A truck. stationary for just a moment. Then gone. Turner, or someone working for him. The storm swallowed the evidence. Ethan's stomach tightened. The temperature inside the barn continued to fall. He layered on another jacket and climbed down to secure the lower level. As he stepped outside to check the small livestock pen he had repaired earlier that week, the wind nearly knocked him sideways. The snow was already ankle-deep and rising. "Just a quick check," he told Rex. They pushed forward together. The shed roof groaned under the accumulating weight. Ethan cleared snow from the doorway and ensured the animals inside were sheltered. The wind cut through him like a blade. On the way back, his boot caught on a frozen rut hidden beneath fresh snow. He went down hard. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. For a moment, the world became only white and wind. He tried to rise, but his foot slipped again. Ice had formed beneath the snow layer, invisible and slick. The cold bit into his exposed wrist where his glove had shifted. His chest tightened, not from the fall, but from the sudden surge of adrenaline. The storm's howl blended into something older, louder, more chaotic. Gunfire, shouting, the ringing aftermath of a blast. He blinked, but the snow blurred into desert dust in his mind. The wind became the rush of air after detonation. His breath came too fast. He was back there. Not here. Rex barked sharply. The sound cut through the memory like a blade. Ethan focused. White snow, cold air, barn 50 yards away. He tried again to stand, but slipped. The wind pushed against him, driving snow into his face. Already his fingers felt numb. Rex moved in front of him, body low and braced against the wind. The dog grabbed Ethan's sleeve with his teeth, not aggressive but firm. "Easy," Ethan rasped. Rex pulled. Ethan rolled onto his side and dug his gloved hands into the snow for traction. With Rex tugging steadily, he managed to drag himself toward a patch of exposed grass near the barn wall. They moved together, inch by inch. By the time they reached the barn entrance, Ethan's legs were shaking violently from cold and exertion. Inside, the temperature wasn't much better, but it was out of the wind. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, chest heaving. Rex stood close, snow clinging to his coat. One paw lifted awkwardly. Ethan dropped to his knees and grabbed the lantern, angling it toward the dog. The right front paw was bleeding lightly. Ice had sliced into the pad during the drag. "Hey," Ethan whispered, voice rough. He removed his glove and gently examined the injury. Not deep, but painful. Rex didn't pull away. "You saved me," Ethan said quietly. The storm outside intensified, wind shrieking like something alive. Snow hammered against the barn boards, rattling the structure. Ethan climbed back into the loft with Rex beside him. He wrapped the dog's paw with clean cloth from his duffel and pulled both of them under the thickest blankets he had. The heater remained dead. The cold pressed in from all sides. Ethan lay awake, listening to the storm batter the mountains. For a moment, the temptation crept in. Call Turner. Take the money. Walk away from this fight. The thought flickered like weak light in darkness. Rex shifted closer, pressing his warm body against Ethan's chest, grounding him. Steady. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed through the noise. This wasn't a battlefield overseas. It was Tennessee. And he wasn't alone. Outside, the blizzard raged without mercy. Inside the barn, 2 survivors clung to warmth, one scarred by war, the other by loyalty. By dawn, the storm would decide who remained standing. And this time, Ethan knew something with certainty. He was not giving this land, or this fight, away. The storm did not end at dawn. It intensified. Snow continued falling in relentless sheets, burying fence posts and swallowing the path to the road entirely. The world beyond the barn disappeared into white silence. Inside, the cold deepened. Ethan woke stiff and half-numb, the blankets crusted with frost along their edges. His breath formed a steady plume in the air. Rex remained pressed against him, the injured paw tucked close to his chest. "You still with me?" Ethan whispered. Rex blinked slowly and thumped his tail once against the wood. Ethan climbed down from the loft carefully. The barn floor had a thin crust of blown-in snow along the walls. The lantern had dimmed overnight. He checked the generator again. Nothing. The metal housing felt brittle in the cold. He crouched and worked at it with slow patience, fingers aching. After 20 minutes, he managed to clear the intake line, warm it with his hands, and try again. The engine coughed weakly, then died. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Outside, wind howled in violent bursts, shaking the barn doors. Snow pressed against the lower cracks. The temperature had dropped further, well below freezing now. Ethan stood still in the middle of the barn, listening to the storm. The sound began to change in his ears. Wind became rotor blades, snow became sand. The rhythmic shaking of the barn became the echo of distant artillery. His breathing tightened. His pulse spiked without warning. The loft beams above him seemed to close in. The narrow space felt smaller, confining. He was back in the desert, trapped inside a building after an explosion, dust choking the air, visibility zero. He squeezed his eyes shut. "It's just weather," he muttered. But his body didn't believe him. The storm screamed harder, rattling the boards. Something metallic outside slammed against wood. He flinched. His mind spiraled. What if Turner had chosen this storm intentionally? What if someone was moving under cover of whiteout conditions? What if... A low whine cut through the chaos. "Rex." The dog limped toward him, pressing firmly against Ethan's leg. Not playful, not excited, anchoring. Ethan dropped to one knee, gripping the dog's shoulders. "Stay with me," he breathed. Rex leaned into him with steady weight. Ethan focused on the feel of fur beneath his hands, the warmth of the dog's body, the rise and fall of Rex's breathing. Inhale, exhale, snowstorm, Tennessee, barn, not overseas. He opened his eyes slowly. The panic receded, not gone but manageable. He ran a hand over Rex's injured paw. The bandage had held overnight. The bleeding had stopped. "You pulled me out there," Ethan said quietly. "Guess I don't get to fall apart now." The storm battered the barn for another hour before easing slightly. The quiet that followed felt fragile. Ethan stood and forced himself into motion. He hauled snow away from the door in small, controlled movements. He checked the animals again. He rationed food and water, survival mode, step by step. By late afternoon, the wind began to thin. The snowfall slowed into drifting flurries. Ethan climbed the slope toward the road, carving a path through knee-deep drifts. Rex followed, favoring the injured paw but refusing to stay behind. At the ridge, the valley stretched out beneath a white blanket. The mountains looked softer now, less violent, more resigned. He checked his phone. No signal. He stared at Blake Turner's number in his contacts. One call, one signature. Heat, money, Safety. The temptation was real. His thumb hovered over the screen. The barn below him looked small against the snow, the burned foundation barely visible beneath white drifts. He imagined leaving. He imagined never hearing the wind in those boards again. He imagined not fighting a developer with deeper pockets and cleaner boots. Rex moved beside him and sat. The dog looked out over the valley, calm. Ethan looked down at him. "You ever think we should have just taken the easy road?" he asked softly. Rex's ears flicked once in the wind. No answer, just presence. Ethan lowered his phone. "No," he said. He scrolled instead to another contact. Sheriff Walter Briggs, retired Marine, neighbor 3 ridges over. He pressed call. This time, one faint bar appeared. The phone rang once, twice. Then a gruff voice answered through static. "Briggs?" "Sir?" Ethan said, steadying his voice. "It's Ethan Cole. I think I've got a situation." Silence on the other end. Then clarity. "Storm's bad up your way," Briggs said. "You safe?" "For now," Ethan replied. "But someone's been circling the property. I found something buried under the old foundation. Documents, evidence. I think Blake Turner's more than a developer." The line crackled. "Don't discuss details over weak signal," Briggs said calmly. "I'll come by when the road's clear." "Appreciate it," Ethan said. "And Cole?" "Yes, sir?" "Storms test foundations. Don't let this one test yours." The line went dead. Ethan stood in the snow a moment longer. The emotional weight shifted again. The isolation of the past weeks eased slightly. He wasn't alone anymore. He had chosen not to carry it alone. He descended the ridge carefully, Rex beside him. As twilight fell, the mountains glowed pale blue beneath the settling snow. The storm had nearly broken him, but it hadn't. Inside the barn, Ethan relit the lantern and reinforced the bandage on Rex's paw. The breaking point had come and passed. Outside, the wind quieted. Inside, something stronger than fear had taken hold. Courage. Earned, not borrowed. The fight had only begun. The storm finally loosened its grip 2 days later. Sunlight broke through in fractured beams across the Smoky Mountains, turning the snow into fields of blinding white. The road remained partially iced, but passable in stretches. Ethan dug his truck free with steady patience, Rex watching from the barn doorway, paw wrapped in healing. "We're taking a drive," Ethan said, tightening the bandage gently. "Time to bring this out of the dark." Rex climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. The descent into town felt surreal. Snow-laden branches bent low over the narrow mountain road. Ice glittered like shattered glass along the edges. Every turn required deliberate control. Halfway down the ridge, Ethan passed a section of fence that had collapsed entirely under snow weight. The cut wire he had found earlier was now buried beneath white drifts. He noticed fresh tire tracks layered over the storm's accumulation. Someone had driven through during the worst of it. His jaw tightened. The town of Alder Ridge emerged from behind the trees like something out of an old postcard. Brick storefronts, a single traffic light, smoke rising from chimneys. The diner sat on the corner near the hardware store, its red neon sign flickering against the winter sky. The bell above the door jingled as Ethan stepped inside. Warmth hit him first, then the smell of coffee and bacon. Conversations paused. Snow clung to his boots and jacket. Rex limped slightly but stood tall beside him, drawing curious glances from a few regulars. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with silver hair and steady eyes. Sheriff Walter Briggs. Even out of uniform, he carried himself like command never left him. "Cole," Briggs said calmly, "you look like hell." "Storm was rough," Ethan replied. Briggs's gaze dropped briefly to Rex's bandaged paw. "Dog take the worst of it?" "He pulled me out of a bad fall," Ethan said. Briggs nodded once, approving. They took a booth in the back. A woman in her 30s slid into the seat across from them moments later. Dark hair pulled into a low ponytail, notepad already in hand. "Maya Hernandez," Briggs introduced. "Investigative reporter out of Asheville. She's been sniffing around Turner's development plans longer than most." Maya extended a hand. "I've heard about the fire on your property." Ethan didn't shake it immediately. He studied her face for signs of performance. He found none. He nodded once and shook her hand. "Good," she said quietly, "because what you have could be important." Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out one of the labeled flash drives. "Creek Survey 2016, he said. "There's more." Maya's expression sharpened. "You've looked at them?" "Not yet. No stable power up there." Briggs leaned back, folding his arms. "You said illegal dumping." Ethan nodded. "My grandfather documented buried chemical drums near the northern creek. Said Turner's company was involved." Maya exchanged a look with Briggs. "I've been tracking complaints about contaminated runoff for 3 years," she said. "Nothing stuck. Inspections always came back clean." "Because someone cleaned the paperwork," Briggs muttered. Ethan felt anger rise. Not explosive, but focused. "During the storm," he added, "someone tampered with my wiring, and I found fresh boot prints near the hatch." Briggs's eyes hardened slightly. "Turner doesn't get his own hands dirty," he said, "but he hires men who don't mind snow." The waitress delivered coffee without interrupting. Rex lay beneath the table, head resting on Ethan's boot. Maya plugged the flash drive into her laptop. They waited. The diner hummed softly around them. Then images appeared on her screen. Photographs of steel drums half buried beneath soil, coordinates marked, soil tests labeled, a series of scanned emails between Turner Development and a subcontractor discussing site management. Maya's lips parted slightly. "This is real," she said. Ethan leaned forward. "You can prove it?" he asked. "With enough digging," she replied. "Yes." Briggs took a slow sip of coffee. "You realize this won't stay quiet," he said to Ethan. "Turner's already got county officials in his pocket." "I'm not asking for quiet," Ethan replied. Silence settled across the table. The emotional weight shifted again. No longer isolation, no longer just survival. Now it was alignment. Maya closed her laptop and met Ethan's eyes. "If we move on this," she said, "he'll push back hard." "He already is," Ethan replied. As if summoned by the thought, the diner door opened again. Blake Turner stepped inside. He removed his gloves calmly, scanning the room until his gaze landed on Ethan. The air changed. Turner approached their booth with controlled ease. "Small town," he said lightly. "Hard to keep secrets." Briggs didn't stand, but his posture straightened. "Morning, Blake." Turner nodded politely. "Sheriff?" His eyes moved to Maya. "Miss Hernandez." Then back to Ethan. "You look cold," Turner said. "Storm hit your property pretty hard from what I hear." "We're fine," Ethan replied evenly. Turner's gaze flicked briefly toward Rex's bandage. "Unfortunate about the dog," he said softly. Ethan's jaw tightened. Turner leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. Property taxes are reassessed next week, he said. It would be unfortunate if someone found your structures non-compliant. Briggs spoke calmly. Threatening a veteran in public is a bold move. Turner smiled thinly. Just advising a neighbor. He stepped back. I'll leave you to breakfast. He exited the diner as smoothly as he had entered. The bell above the door rang once. Silence lingered. Maya exhaled slowly. He's nervous, she said. Good, Ethan replied. Briggs nodded. Which means he's going to escalate. Ethan looked down at Rex. The dog's eyes were steady, watchful. The emotional shift was complete. From fear to solidarity. From isolation to alliance. Ethan took another sip of coffee and stared out the diner window at the snow-covered mountains beyond town. They circled, he said quietly. Now they'll charge. And this time he would not stand alone. The night it happened, the temperature dropped again. The storm had passed days earlier, but winter still clung to the Smoky Mountains like unfinished business. Snow crusted the ground in hard, uneven sheets. The moon hung pale and distant above the ridge. Ethan had installed 2 trail cameras that afternoon, one facing the old foundation, another positioned along the tree line near the road. He worked in silence while Rex monitored the perimeter, his injured paw improving but still wrapped. Sheriff Briggs had promised to return the next morning with a portable generator and a secure laptop so they could examine the rest of the files together. Maya had already begun drafting a preliminary inquiry, carefully avoiding direct accusation until evidence was fully verified. Turner had not made another public appearance. That was what worried Ethan. Quiet men with resources were rarely idle. By 10 o'clock, the barn was dark except for a low lantern glow in the loft. Ethan lay awake, listening to the subtle sounds of winter, the distant crack of contracting wood, the faint rustle of wind through branches. Rex stirred. Not restless, alert. Ethan opened his eyes. The barn felt different. He didn't hear anything at first, just silence. Then, a soft crunch. Snow. Not falling. Stepped on. Ethan slid quietly from the loft and moved toward the barn door. He didn't switch on the lantern. He let his eyes adjust to the faint moonlight slipping through the slats. Rex stood beside him, body rigid. Another crunch. Closer. Someone was moving near the foundation. Ethan reached into the trunk and retrieved a heavy wooden handle he had been using for repairs. Not a weapon of war, just a solid piece of hardwood. He whispered to Rex, "Stay." The dog did not move. Ethan eased the barn door open a fraction. Cold air rushed in. Moonlight revealed shadows near the old fireplace stones. 2 figures dressed in dark jackets, kneeling at the disturbed soil. One of them lifted the steel hatch slightly. They knew. Ethan stepped fully outside. "You're on private property," he said evenly. The figures froze. One stood slowly, holding something metallic in his hand, a pry tool. "We're just checking damage," the man replied casually. "In the middle of the night?" Ethan asked. The second figure moved toward the barn. Rex lunged. The dog crossed the distance in a heartbeat, a low growl erupting into a sharp bark. He clamped onto the sleeve of the second intruder, pulling him off balance. The first man swung the pry tool instinctively. It struck Rex's side with a dull, sickening thud. The sound cut through the cold air. Ethan moved without hesitation. Years of training compressed into a single decisive motion. He closed the gap and grabbed the wrist of the man holding the tool, twisting sharply. The pry tool fell into the snow. The intruder stumbled backward, slipping on ice. The second man struggled under Rex's grip, but the dog did not let go. "Rex, out!" Ethan commanded sharply. Rex released immediately, retreating but remaining between Ethan and the men. The first intruder attempted to run. Ethan stepped forward and hooked his leg around the man's ankle, sending him crashing into the snow. He pinned him there with firm pressure, not striking, just controlling. "Stay down," Ethan said, voice low and steady. The second man scrambled to his feet, clutching his torn sleeve. Headlights flared suddenly at the top of the ridge. Sheriff Briggs's truck. The engine roared down the slope, tires crunching through frozen snow. Red and blue lights flickered silently as he pulled into the property. The intruders froze. Briggs stepped out, weapon holstered, but posture unmistakable. "Evening," he said calmly. "Care to explain what you're doing digging under a veteran's burned house?" Neither man answered. Briggs handcuffed them with practiced efficiency. Ethan stepped back, breathing steady but heavy. Then he looked down. Rex was limping. The earlier paw injury had reopened, and a darker stain spread across the snow near his side where the pry tool had struck. "Hey," Ethan whispered, kneeling quickly. Rex's eyes were alert, but his breathing was faster than normal. "You're okay," Ethan said, voice tightening. Briggs crouched beside them. "He take the hit?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. "Ambulance won't make it fast up here tonight," Briggs said quietly. "We'll get him into town." Ethan lifted Rex carefully, cradling the dog's weight against his chest. Rex did not resist. He simply leaned into him. Snow clung to the dog's fur, melting against Ethan's jacket. The intruders sat restrained near the patrol truck, faces pale under moonlight. Briggs studied them. "Turner's security subcontractors," he muttered. "I recognize the logo on the truck." The emotional surge hit Ethan all at once. Not fear, not hesitation, protective fury. They had crossed the line. They had struck the one creature who had never left his side. Ethan carried Rex into the back of Briggs's truck and climbed in beside him. As they drove toward town, the trail camera near the foundation captured everything: the break-in, the confrontation, the strike. Evidence. Undeniable. At the small-town clinic, a veterinarian was called in from home. X-rays showed bruising along Rex's ribs, but no fractures. The paw injury was cleaned and stitched properly. Ethan sat beside the exam table, one hand resting gently on Rex's neck. "You could have stayed back," he whispered. Rex opened his eyes and looked at him steadily. No regret. No fear. Just loyalty. By the time they returned to the farm near dawn, the snow had turned pink beneath the rising sun. The foundation stood quiet again. The hatch remained sealed. But something had changed. Turner's escalation had failed, and this time, it had been recorded. Ethan stepped out of the truck, carrying Rex carefully. The cold air burned his lungs. The mountains looked peaceful, deceptively so. But beneath that calm lay proof. Proof that the fire had not been the end. Proof that the fight was no longer hidden. Ethan looked toward the ridge where Turner's truck had once slowed. "You wanted to scare me," he said softly into the morning air. "You just gave me the evidence." Beside him, Rex rested against his shoulder. Blood had stained the snow, but neither of them had fallen. By the end of that week, the story had moved beyond the mountain. Sheriff Briggs filed trespassing and attempted property tampering charges against the two contractors. The trail camera footage was clear, faces visible, tools in hand. Rex struck without provocation. Maya Hernandez uploaded a carefully edited report to her paper's website, presenting the footage alongside archived complaints about contaminated runoff in the valley. Within 48 hours, the quiet town of Alder Ridge was no longer quiet. State environmental authorities announced a preliminary inquiry. A federal agency requested access to the flash drives. Turner Development released a public statement denying all allegations. Ethan watched it unfold from the barn loft, Rex resting beside him, ribs wrapped but healing well. The dog's breathing was steady again. The stitches on his paw were clean. "You look better than I do," Ethan murmured one morning, scratching behind Rex's ear. The phone buzzed. Sheriff Briggs. "They're holding a county meeting tonight," Briggs said over the line. "Turner wants to present his side. Claims you're obstructing economic growth." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You going?" Briggs asked. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "Good. Bring the dog." The meeting hall sat at the edge of town, an old brick building that had hosted everything from harvest festivals to school plays. That evening, every folding chair was filled. Farmers in work boots, retirees in pressed jackets, young families with curious eyes. Blake Turner stood near the front, crisp suit pressed, expression composed. When Ethan entered with Rex at his side, conversations dipped into murmurs. The bandage on Rex's side was still visible beneath his fur. The paw wrap was clean but obvious. Turner noticed immediately. He smiled politely. The county commissioner called the meeting to order. Turner stepped forward first. "My company has invested millions into development planning for this valley," he began smoothly. "Resorts bring jobs, infrastructure, tourism revenue. Unfortunately, misinformation has been circulated suggesting environmental misconduct." He gestured toward Ethan without naming him. "I respect our veterans," Turner continued. But accusations without context can harm an entire community." Murmurs rippled through the room. Ethan listened calmly. When the commissioner invited public comment, Briggs stood. "I've known this valley 50 years, he said evenly, "and I've never seen contractors dig under a man's house at midnight for charitable reasons." Soft laughter moved through the hall. Then Maya rose. She connected her laptop to the projector at the front of the room. Images filled the screen. Steel drums buried in forest soil. Coordinates overlaid with creek maps. Emails between Turner's subcontractors discussing containment delays. Gasps followed. Finally, the trail camera footage played. 2 men digging beneath the burned foundation. One swinging a pry tool. Rex taking the hit. The room went silent. Turner's expression tightened, but only slightly. "That video proves nothing about dumping," he said calmly. "It shows contractors retrieving company property." "Under a veteran's foundation?" someone called from the back. Ethan stood. He walked slowly to the front of the hall, Rex limping gently beside him. "I didn't ask for this land," Ethan began. His voice was steady, not raised. "I didn't ask for a fire. I didn't ask for men digging under my home in the middle of a snowstorm." He paused, scanning the room. "I asked for quiet, for space to rebuild my life." His gaze moved to Turner. "But if my grandfather documented buried chemicals feeding into this valley's water, then it stops being about money." He looked back toward the townspeople. "It becomes about your wells, your livestock, your children." The silence that followed felt heavier than snow. Turner stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Cole is emotional," he said smoothly. "Understandably so. But development requires vision, sacrifices." Ethan met his eyes. "I've made enough sacrifices." The commissioner cleared his throat. "Given the evidence presented, This board is requesting a formal environmental review and a temporary halt to all development permits in the Northern Valley. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in conversation, relief, surprise. Turner's smile finally faded. He approached Ethan quietly as the meeting dissolved into small groups. "You think this is over?" Turner asked softly. "No," Ethan replied. "I think it's beginning." Turner studied Rex's bandage one last time. "You've made this expensive," he said. Ethan's voice did not waver. "Good." Turner turned and walked toward the exit without another word. Outside, the night air felt sharp but clean. The ridge overlooking the valley glowed faintly under moonlight. Briggs stepped beside Ethan. "Federal agents are coming up tomorrow," he said. "They'll want to see the site." Ethan nodded. Maya joined them, hands tucked into her coat pockets. "You just shifted the balance," she said quietly. "Public pressure matters." Ethan looked down at Rex. The dog stood tall despite the limp. "You shifted it," Maya added softly, nodding toward Rex. Ethan knelt and ran his fingers along the dog's neck. "You hear that?" he whispered. "You're famous." Rex blinked slowly, unimpressed. The emotional tide had turned. Fear had given way to defiance, defiance to rising triumph. But Ethan knew something important. Victory in rooms was not the same as victory on land. He drove back up the mountain with Rex beside him. The foundation greeted them in moonlight. No longer just ashes, no longer just warning. Now it felt like ground reclaimed. He stood there a long time, staring at the ridgeline. The fight had moved into the open, and this time, Turner was no longer circling unseen. He was exposed. Beside Ethan, Rex lifted his head toward the valley below. The mountains did not cheer. They simply watched and waited. The mountains had always been patient. Through storms, through fire, through men who thought they could carve them into profit. Spring arrived slowly in the Smoky Mountains, not with sudden warmth, but with small, deliberate changes. Snow retreated from the ridges in uneven patches. The creek along the northern edge of the property ran stronger, clearer, louder. Federal investigators came in trucks with official seals. Soil samples were taken from the coordinates Ethan's grandfather had marked. Survey flags dotted the tree line like quiet sentinels. The results took weeks. When they came, they confirmed what the old man had suspected years ago. Buried chemical waste upstream. Contamination contained for now, but present. Development permits for Turner's Northern Valley project were suspended indefinitely. A formal investigation into contracting practices followed. Blake Turner stopped coming up the mountain. His truck no longer slowed near the property. His lawyers issued statements. His company denied intent. But the ridge remained silent in answer. For Ethan, the shift was quieter. He did not celebrate the permit suspension. He did not stand at the fireplace slab and declare victory. Instead, he worked. The foundation was cleared of debris first. Charred beams were hauled away. Nails were sorted from ash. With help from Sheriff Briggs and 2 local volunteers from town, the slab was leveled and reinforced. Rex, now fully healed, moved steadily across the property, no longer limping. The scar along his side remained faint, but visible beneath his fur, a reminder of the night in the snow. "You wear it well," Ethan told him one evening, scratching behind his ear. The barn doors were replaced next. Proper hinges, solid lumber. The hand pump was upgraded to a modern well system, donated quietly by a local contractor who had watched the county meeting and decided he liked courage more than development promises. Maya's articles continued to draw attention, not sensational, just steady and factual. The town began to look at the ridge differently, not as wasted land, but as protected ground. 1 year after the night of blood in the snow, the porch stood again, not identical to the old farmhouse. Stronger. Ethan had chosen a timber frame design, wide beams, open structure, large windows facing the valley. The fireplace stones had been rebuilt into a new hearth, preserving the original shape but clearing the damage. The steel hatch beneath the floor remained, but it was empty now. The evidence had been catalogued and stored with authorities. The land itself had been placed under conservation protection, ensuring no future development could disturb the creek or the forest beyond it. Ethan sat on the new porch one evening as the sun lowered behind the ridge. The sky burned orange and gold. Mist gathered in the valley below like a quiet memory. Rex lay at his feet, head resting on crossed paws. A small wooden sign now stood at the entrance to the property. Coal Ridge Veterans Retreat. The idea had come slowly. After the investigation began, a young veteran from Knoxville had written to Ethan after reading Maya's article. He had struggled with PTSD after discharge. He didn't know where to land. Ethan invited him up for a weekend. Then another came, and another. No therapy sessions, no formal programs, just land, work. Silence that healed instead of haunted. They repaired fences, cleared trails, built raised garden beds. At night, they sat around the rebuilt fireplace and talked about storms that weren't on mountains. Rex moved between them like quiet reassurance, settling beside whichever man's voice grew tight first. Now, 1 year later, the porch held more than Ethan's boots. It held chairs built by hands that once carried rifles. It held coffee cups at dawn. It held the kind of laughter that came after survival, not before. Ethan unfolded his grandfather's letter and read the final lines again. Guard the land, guard the water, guard the people who stand on it. He folded it carefully and placed it inside a cedar box beneath the hearth. Did my part, he murmured. Rex lifted his head. The valley below was quiet. Not empty, not threatened, just still. Sheriff Briggs's truck pulled into the gravel drive slowly, no lights flashing, no urgency. He stepped out and walked onto the porch. Looks different, Briggs said, scanning the timber beams. Feels different, Ethan replied. Briggs nodded toward the sign at the entrance. You staying busy? Ethan smiled faintly. Busy's good. Briggs rested his hands on the railing and looked out over the ridge. Turner's project officially dissolved this morning, he said. Investors pulled out. Ethan did not react dramatically. He simply nodded once. Rex stood and stretched, then leaned against Ethan's leg. The emotional arc had come full circle. From despair to suspicion, to fury, to defiance now. Peace. Not the fragile kind, the earned kind. The porch creaked softly as the sun dipped lower. Ethan looked down at Rex. Rock bottom, he said quietly, is still solid ground. The dog blinked slowly, content. Below them, the creek ran clean through the valley. Above them, the mountains stood patient, and where ash once lay scattered across frozen earth, a home now stood. Not just for one man and his dog, but for anyone who needed to remember that standing back up is its own kind of victory. If you believe a man has the right to defend his land and protect what's his, type yes in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from. Out here, justice isn't loud, it's steady. And if stories about grit, loyalty, and standing your ground mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more coming from these mountains.